Hi, welcome to Gender Nebulous, Season 2, Episode 5. Got a very special guest today. It's Robin Moyer-White from Old Square Chambers, and probably the only transgender lawyer you've probably heard of. So welcome, Robin.
Good evening.
Good evening. Great to have you on the podcast, Robin. I think just to get things going, I just wanted to talk about what kind of law it is that you specialize in. I know you practice in all kinds of employment law, but I think it's employment and discrimination.
Yeah, I'm a fairly heavyweight practitioner these days. So today is, for example, day 2 of a 5-day case here in Croydon.
Right, and you were the first barrister to transition in practice.
At the discrimination bar.
At the discrimination bar, yeah. So just for those who are not legal people, when you say discrimination bar, what does that mean?
The group of barristers who practice in discrimination law.
Yeah.
So we talk about the Chancery Bar or the Family Bar or whatever, in terms of that being barristers who do chancery work or family work, for example.
Okay, so how many in your kind of specialist area would you say are in the UK are trans barristers who have specialist knowledge in trans issues?
Only me. In
Right.
terms of the discrimination bar, there is one non-binary barrister who does some discrimination cases, but otherwise I'm it.
Because you have been referred to as a terrier in the tribunals and a calm but quietly effective advocate.
Yeah, the terrier thing is, I think if you get me stuck on your ankle, I'm hard to get rid of.
That's the kind of barrister you need on your side, really.
Hopefully. And I spent today cross-examining the claimant in the case I'm here doing in Croydon. And I sometimes say to law students that cross-examination is the second most fun you can have with your clothes on.
So you must really enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm lucky. I mean, I'm 28 years. I've been doing this for 28 years, and I probably get as much, if not more, enjoyment now than I did when I started.
Yeah, so you are the go-to, I've heard you also referred to as the go-to lawyer for trans issues. There is one interesting case that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, which was the Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover case, quite a famous one. But you also used to be working in a completely different field, didn't you? You used to be working in train transportation. You were a manager was it for British Rail?
When I left university, I joined British Railways on their management training scheme. And for 5 years, my job was to make the trains run on time. And it is possible.
Doesn't seem possible at the moment, does it? Gosh.
Well, it was a better time, I think, because we were one British Railways. And actually, the system runs much better as a unified system than it does broken into 1,000 bits like it is now.
Yeah, I think that could be true of a lot of things, to be honest.
You do a lot of posting on Facebook about train and car stuff, I've noticed.
Well, I'm a petrol head.
Yeah.
And I quite like my vintage aircraft as well. So,
well, I've had many a fun time on the East Lancs Railway. So it's I think that's
that's very carry on, isn't it? Oh, I've had a fun time on the railway.
I didn't quite mean it like that, but I do like my old I do like my old steam trains, and they do like these vintage fairs and things like that. So
pick me up Rawton Stall of a Saturday evening.
Yes, lovely. It's a lovely journey.
I do have to compliment on some of the caption things you were doing on Facebook. You know, you put a picture and you asked for a caption. Some of those were hilarious, really.
I have to say that I carry it into my law that humor can be very powerful. It can be very dangerous, but if you get it wrong, but very powerful. And I've shaded into politics with a small p as well. And I think you have to have a certain personal resilience and the ability to laugh at the world and yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, life can seem very long.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
I was going to
having a
say
good sense of humor is a good thing.
I was going to say, I think some people find you quite stoic and you come across sometimes as quite very serious, but online you seem quite, it's like you can have a laugh. But do you think that's...
You certainly can, and there are times when it's appropriate to have a laugh.
Yeah.
And today I've been cross-examining a claimant in a discrimination case. A person who has had a really tough time, and it's not appropriate to make a joke about them. You can always make a joke about the lawyers, and we actually have had a bit of a laugh and joke during the day, but about the lawyers or things happening in the case, but not about the person who's the subject of the case. And that's why, if you're going to introduce a bit of levity here and there, you do have to be very careful about how and who and all those things.
Yeah. So when you were working for the rail company, you did face some discrimination yourself, didn't you?
Well, that's why I left.
That's why you left and became a barrister, I believe.
It wasn't my choice. It was as long ago. I'm very old, so it was as long ago as 1990 when trans people didn't have legal protection in the UK, and I was actually good at my job, but was hounded out because I was trans, and I was very ill for a short period, and had some good friends look after me and get me back on track, and got well, and then chose to requalify as a lawyer and become a discrimination barrister. I can't imagine what the connection between those two things are.
So that was really the thing that got you into, being a barrister, lawyer, experiencing that kind of...
Yeah, I wouldn't have been suitable aged... When did I go to university, first of all? Aged 17, 18. My first degree was chemistry at Imperial, very down the line science, and I was much happier inside a test tube than outside it. Of course, in America, you can only do law as a graduate school. You can't do that to start with. And I think that extra degree of maturity when I went back to university 7 or 8 years after I'd been there the first time made all the difference in being a lawyer. It certainly did for me. I'm sure there are plenty of good, mature, younger people.
Well, we're certainly glad you made that decision. And when
Yeah,
I've seen you in the Women and Equalities meetings, I think there was one in February. It was. It's very, very impressive, and I don't think I'd be able to keep my cool like you do in those kind of things.
It goes with the job, really. It goes with the job.
I mean, you do face a lot of, abuse online. I have noticed this on Twitter. When I've seen you in those Women and Equalities committees, you've had certain people sat behind you. I'm sure that's a very uncomfortable experience.
Well, at the meeting in January, I had Maya Forstater and Helen Joyce sitting behind me.
Yeah.
And I didn't see it until I reviewed the effectively broadcast of the committee proceedings. But they were acting in a very disrespectful way to the committee and the evidence in terms of having a laugh about things that they thought were laughable. I just think it's sad. I think I wouldn't. I mean, how privileged I was to be giving evidence to our Parliament, which I've done twice in Westminster now, once in Scotland. And even to attend something like that as a member of the public is a privilege and a responsibility. And I always think if it's me there, I often have a post-it note stuck on my laptop when I'm doing things like that says, "Don't be the nutter." Because if you represent a community or are thought to represent a community, then almost how you say the things you say is almost as important as what you say in some ways. And but it's such a privilege to be involved in such things, and I think it's something to treat with respect. And it can, in a tiny way, alter the direction of travel of our country in the future, and to have that opportunity to do something like that is just amazing.
It's great to see you representing the trans. I mean, I don't know how you feel about whether you feel you're representing the trans community. You're just representing the facts as you see them. But I've seen you in quite hostile situations on GB News, for example, opposite people, which, I mean, I've been in those situations, so I can kind of empathize. But you are so cool. I mean, the way you spoke when you were opposite Sarah Phillimore, I mean, the less said about Sarah Phillimore, the better, I think, at the moment. But when I saw that, I thought, well, that is so unusual to see someone like you on a show like, or even on a TV station. Like, we know what's happened with Dan Wheaton.
I always think you have to take the battle to the enemy.
Yeah, I think that too. Yeah.
I think that's why Press for Change, for example, were very successful around the time, in the early noughties of the 2000s, in terms of getting things like the Gender Recognition Act in place, because they were prepared to be out there. And arguably, you win the world one person at a time. I mean, we have very clear evidence that the attitude that people take to trans people is very different if they know a trans person or have met a trans person.
Yeah,
I find that, especially. Sorry to interrupt you there. Just saying about when I've been in those media situations, I have people message me afterwards to say it was so nice to see a trans voice, because obviously we can do podcasts and get a few hundred views, but when you're on a national broadcaster, I think that is when you can change people's minds. Yeah,
I mean, I did before the Westminster debate, Westminster Hall debate, which we had a few weeks ago. I ended up on BBC Politics Live.
Oh yes, I saw that. Yeah,
and got some abuse, but got some really nice messages afterwards that said, how nice to see somebody out there front and center.
Well, what's always come across to me when I have done anything like that is unfortunately, people haven't listened. A lot of people that hate us don't listen anyway. They'll just point out the way I look and say I don't. Do you know what I mean? Just really snipey, nasty things. But the people that are listening, the people that care about the subject, they're the people that matter. And obviously on Talk TV, GB News, things like that, their audience is already full of misogyny and homophobia, transphobia, and any kind of. So it's like it almost feels like you're sometimes being thrown to the lions, But to stay as calm as you do, but
the White family have always marched towards the sound of gunfire. We're not the easiest people to live with sometimes, but about every 50 years or so, you need us. Right. Grandfather White first visited France across the Normandy beaches, so that's the sort of family tradition.
That's great.
And it's a bit like being a barrister is a bit like that. You do have to be front and center. And the bar professional code talks about being fearless in the promotion of your client's case. And either that's how you are to start with, or that's how you get sort of forged on the anvil of pupillage when you become a barrister.
Yeah.
And it's what we do.
So you've faced a lot of, kind of harsh questioning or comments from others during some of those meetings, and you just remain completely unflappable, stoic. You stick to your point. And whenever I see that you're coming on a show, I always try to make sure I watch it, because it doesn't really matter the topic. I just want to see somebody, like you standing up for us. I think it's great.
Well, the other thing is that I these days get involved with people who are just starting out as barristers or are potential barristers who are either towards the end of their law degree or studying for the bar or whatever. And in fact, it's lovely. I'll be 60 later this year. They are in their early 20s, and all that youth and enthusiasm and optimism for the future that they bring is just wonderful to be part of. But it's lovely when they say, seeing someone who is from a diverse community, and it's not just one community, but seeing someone who is diverse, getting on, being in a good place, having a good career.
Yeah.
People tell me is really encouraging for younger people to think that, you know, they could be diverse at the bar, for example, and in other professions, and, you know, be accepted in the world.
Yeah, it's hugely important.
I always thought that was sort of tokenism, and I'd always slightly poo-pooed this idea. I mean, back to trains. There's this trainbow thing, you know, where people during Pride stick a rainbow sticker on trains, and I'd always thought that stuff, and the same about being a you know, someone who is an example for others. I'd always thought that was because it's
tokenism.
You know, I guess I didn't have it personally, so I just had to get on with it. And I was completely changed in my view by the fact there's a train company called Southeastern that runs around Kent, and I know Kent a little bit. And they did one of these trainbow things, stuck a vinyl on a train, and their diverse workforce, and they have a lot of LGBT people amongst their workforce, was so made up that their senior management had done, you know, with 50 quid's worth of vinyl sticker on a train, had just said, yes, we value.
That's what it's about, yeah.
And I know that a number of staff reacted really well and thought a lot about their company and their management because they'd done that.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, if that's done unprompted and it doesn't cost much, I think it's really kind of a nice thing for companies to do, to show support. You know,
it has to show the philosophy of the company, because there's no point doing it, you know, oh, it's Pride Month, we're going to do something.
No, I mean, it needs to be reasoning behind it. Yeah.
But if it is actually an expression of, we as a company value diversity and value our staff, whoever they are, then it's really important.
Yeah, and if it's built into the DNA of the company throughout everything it does and all its processes, yeah, that's great.
But it's like when you see the Pride flag, like say they put it outside hospitals, fire stations, ambulance stations, it kind of means that, you know, we are doing our best, we're doing our little bit. It might seem like tokenism, but actually, you know, it shows that the people at the top or the management there have thought about something, and it might, you know, even
and in quite unexpected places, people will have seen that the MI6 ziggurat on Thames flies the Pride flag and the trans flag, actually, and has done for Pride. And so in places that you might not think that diverse people would be welcomed, actually in, you know, some of the most important bits of our society, the management value diverse people, and actually for very good reasons, because they bring to the work of organizations like that, then, you know, diversity, and the same is true of other organizations, diversity is tremendously important and a strengthening factor for the organization in what it does.
Yeah, if you look at the, you know, the top 50 companies that are listed in Stonewall's quality index, you know, a lot of those companies, when you look at that list, you would, some of them are quite surprising. You know, MI6 is one of them. You know, they're on there.
Yeah. So, do you mind if we go on to the topic of Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover? Because this was a huge one.
It's dangerous. Like, it's really dangerous to get barristers talking about their favourite case.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, if you don't want to talk about
just as a little side issue, just before we start on that, I did actually meet Rose in Manchester last year, just by chance at the Sparkle event. I was just chatting to this person in this hotel reception thing that had been put on, and it happened to be Rose Taylor, and then the penny dropped, and it was the same Rose. So
Well, I did want to speak about it because it was brought up in the recent meeting, Caroline Noakes with Faulkner and the people from the AHRC who have been in trouble recently, and that they did mention this case, and as something, I mean, Faulkner mentioned it as something that caused them a problem almost, and it was like I can imagine why, because they had to think about something. But moving on.
Well, it does. You see, the thing about diversity in society, you can have a very simple society we had a very simple society a couple of 100 years ago where, you know, to own property, you had to be male. To be an MP, you had to be male. To vote, you had to be male. And then we moved into women's emancipation. And then, I mean, it's appalling to think that we only had a Sex Discrimination Act in 1975. I was born in 1963, and a Race Relations Act in 1976. I mean, my father used to run building sites in London in the late 60s, where it was normal and lawful to have signs up that said no blacks and no Irish. You know, and people are appalled by that idea. And you can either have a very simple society that doesn't look after people who are in some way diverse, but as you add in protections for different groups of diverse people, it does add more complexity into how you have to protect people and how you have to run society. And Taylor and Jaguar, which now says very clearly that non-binary and gender fluid people are protected under the Equality Act. They always have been. In fact, we looked back at the parliamentary proceedings, which is how we showed that they were. But a lot of people didn't think so. And it is more complex, because if you are going to, in a workplace, support non-binary people, for example, forget the debate about which toilets do people use if we're talking about trans people, binary trans people. But if we then add in non-binary people, you know, that is another level of complexity for an employer to have to engage with, and for the equalities structures to have to engage with. I mean, we don't, yes, we now have that protection in the workplace, probably, although Taylor and Jaguar is, of course, first instance, and is, so that protection is potentially fragile because it's challengeable. It didn't go to appeal, but you know, the reasoning is from a wonderful employment judge called Patricia Hughes, who is, you know, really an excellent discrimination judge. But to have that complexity, employers have got to now think about enhancing their policies, ensuring that people don't discriminate against non-binary people who weren't previously protected. And so that's another layer of complexity for people to engage with, or employers to engage with. And there is a cost to society in terms of each level of protection. Now, it's right, in my view, it's right that we bear that cost and that we have those protections for people. But it is another layer of complexity that HR departments and employers organizations and institutions like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, excuse me while I spit screen for a moment, the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
We'll cut that bit out, sorry.
No, don't.
No, keep that bit in, I think.
Yeah, I think I've said a few things about the Equality and Human Rights Commission under its current management and commissioners. It's like something out of, I don't know, 1984, really, in terms of, you know, the non-equality of non-human rights commission, or what some people have called it. But it, for them, when they're not really into advancing rights under the current management, is, as you say, undoubtedly a problem.
Yeah, so you know, I was just on that, you know, on that case that was, you know, established gender fluid and non-binary individuals are protected by the Act. It was I think it was the first case that did that. So does that set any kind of a precedent, or do we need more cases to do that?
No, it's a first instance case, so it's not binding on another tribunal.
Okay.
And in fact, I was due to do a case this year in the Leeds tribunal, but that settled, where the employer, in the case that we were going to hear in Leeds, wanted to argue that Taylor and Jaguar was wrong. Now, I was for the employee, so we were going to go around the same loop again. And they can do that until a case gets to the. I mean, the wonderful thing about Taylor and Jaguar was how Jaguar Land Rover and their lawyers were so convinced they were right that they fought it to the echo. Why on earth they didn't settle the case earlier, goodness only knows, but they didn't, and they took it right through to judgment. And so we got a nice, long, helpful judgment. At that point, they woke up and smelled coffee and didn't appeal it, although they had talked about that. So it doesn't have precedent value, but the logic and the argument in it have value in terms of being applied to other cases in other courts, and it's been commented on in other cases.
Yeah.
So, and it's thought to be very well argued in the judgment by the judge. So I know it's been quoted in a few other cases.
So that will help support other cases, and at some point we will get to the stage when we have enough.
I mean, we'll get, if that case in Leeds had gone ahead and the employers had not liked the result and then appealed that, then that would become, once the case has been heard at the Employment Appeal Tribunal, it becomes a precedent and is then binding on cases below. But anybody's entitled to see the judgment and can use the logic.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, especially me and maybe Frida, we're not lawyers, we're not legal people, so sometimes it's quite difficult to follow. It's quite difficult to understand and follow, all these cases and what they mean legally. You can get yourself really confused.
There's a great book called A Practical Guide to Transgender Law.
Would that be this one?
Yeah,
We've both got that book.
But
you'll have to put it in the middle, Vicky, else the green screen will block it.
With a wonderful pair of authors, i.e. myself and one of my colleagues from Chambers. We desperately need to get, we have done 2 free updates to the book since it's been published. And there is due to be a 3rd one. And one of my summer tasks is to get that 3rd update written, because there have been, and you can just throw the old updates away. They're available from the publisher's website. I mean,
so the publisher is Law Brief Publishing.
Law Brief Publishing, yeah.
Yeah, and I've not actually downloaded the updates, but I intend to.
Yeah. And they're free. We don't need multiple ones. So update 2 includes everything from update 1 still there, and update 3, which will be out by the end of the summer, will include everything before and all the new stuff up to date.
So I have read the book, and I did buy Frida a copy. So we both refer to this book when we're trying to understand legal cases.
But it seems sometimes that the cases are so unique and so I wouldn't say difficult, but it's like when I've tried to understand the Mayor Forstate case. It's just so convoluted. It just seems to be that the ruling is, okay, you're allowed to be as horrible as you want. Okay, now go away. Seems to be the only thing. That seems to be my only takeaway.
No, but that's not right. In that, holding a belief is one thing. You can have the most horrible beliefs in your head. Now, are they protected? Well, that pulls us back in from the most horrible beliefs that are not protected. But in a free society, people have to be free to hold challenging beliefs. I mean, if that wasn't so, think about the example we were talking about earlier. We wouldn't have women's suffrage. We wouldn't have women MPs. We wouldn't have had, I mean, it was the Grunwick dispute, but you don't remember that brought the Race Relations Act into effect. In 1976, there was an awful dispute called the Grunwick dispute. Go and look it up. But people didn't have protection from race discrimination in the UK until the mid-70s. And there's another case called the Bristol bus drivers case. Also was part of that. Bristol had brought a lot of people in from the Caribbean to be bus conductors, and they'd been good conductors for a while, and the drivers were paid more than the conductors, and the people from the Caribbean said, well, we'd like to be drivers. And the drivers union, they were separately represented by the Transport and General Workers Union, said, no, we're not having these awful people from the Caribbean taking our jobs. And so you had effectively 2 unions fighting with each other. And for a year, as I understand it, in the late 60s, you could travel free on the buses in Bristol because all the conductors went on strike. So the buses carried on driving around, but nobody was collecting the fares. And I think Bristol Corporation...
That's a good protest.
Trouble. And that was another one of... So those... And people held views that were challenging to society at the time, but we now recognise as right. Now, there are all sorts of odd views that people hold. and in a free society are entitled to. But then you move on to the next stage and say, well, can you manifest them? What can you do with those views? And we at the moment have this transgender critical fight, frankly, going on. And I get asked about this all the time by employers. And I use an analogy, and I say, well, look, quite some time we've had people in same-sex relationships out in the workplace. And we've also got people with strong religious views. And sometimes those clash. Some people with strong religious views are not supportive of people in same-sex relationships, for example. But we don't have sheets of flame breaking out in all directions between religious people in workplaces and people in same-sex relationships. We seem to have worked out where the boundary is. To what extent can you bring those views to work?
Yeah. Well,
and
with this, it seems very politically
but
propelled.
we're as a society working through it in the same way that we had, you couldn't put signs up that said no blacks and no Irish once we got protection against race discrimination. At the moment, we're working through the transgender critical thing and working out where the boundaries are, how far people are allowed to express challenging views that other people might find uncomfortable. How uncomfortable can you make other people in terms of expressing your views? And we're plainly working through that issue. And there is a bit of a battleground between different groups in workplaces. So, for example, in the civil service, there's a thing called the SWN, which is the gender critical network in the civil service. The civil service is quite forward in LGBT rights. But now there are gender critical people in the civil service who say, well, we have our beliefs. We have a right to organise and express our beliefs. And in a free society, that must be right to some extent. But where is the boundary between having that belief and expressing that belief in a way that makes someone else uncomfortable in their workplace? And this is why I love my law, actually, because in the end, the law courts end up working out where those boundaries are and what rights do people have to express challenging views when they bump into other people's rights to comfortably go to work and, use public facilities or go to a shop or whatever, or engage in competitive sport, for example, and there are different views on rights related to that. So that's how, and in a sensible liberal Western democracy that we live in, the way that you resolve those rights is partly by discussion and sometimes by litigation. And of course, we're always there to help as far as the litigation is concerned.
So this topic of free speech versus hate speech and where the boundary is, I find that quite difficult to navigate myself. Like, when does free speech start turning into hate speech, and then when does hate speech start turning into incitement and all that kind of stuff? It's like it's very difficult to define and understand.
The far edges, we have very clear boundaries. So there is an issue at the moment about something that someone said on one of the Pride marches, Pride events in London, which seemed very clearly to me to be encouragement about violence. Now, that many people might think that goes across a line. Other people might take the view that it's legitimate protest, and the legitimate protest needs to be challenging. Now, I think it's fairly clear that inciting physical violence against other people is going to go across a line, and if that's what the person did. Whereas we've just had a case in Scotland, for example, where Joanna Cherry, QC, had been to the police. Casey, sorry, still not quite got rewired from losing good old Queen Beth. Someone had posted on social media a comment about Joe Cherry, and she went to the police with that, and there was a court case in the last few days where the Scottish courts have ruled no, the person concerned had no real intention to cause Joe Cherry harm, and therefore wasn't going to be prosecuted for what they said. I think it was having a pop at her or something like that was the phrase that was used. And so the courts looked at that and said, well, that's the right side of the line. There are, you can say, once again, you can say quite challenging things, and we don't put you away.
Yeah, I was going to say, when it comes to like in employment situations, for me, it's like if somebody is persistently misgendering or trying to harm me, and it
doesn't have to be. I mean, let's take the argument away, perhaps, from trans or gender critical. A single racist remark is wrong, and can be harassment of someone if it's intended to make their life unpleasant or difficult or whatever. And all three of us have been through transition of one sort or another, and we know the difficulty that friends have, for example, in terms of getting used to revised pronoun use and how we be referred
understandable.
Yeah. And people who've known trans people for a long time often take a while to get used to new names and new pronouns. And there's a very big difference, isn't there, between someone who accidentally uses the wrong pronoun or the wrong name and someone, and then there's the next level on is somebody who perhaps makes no particular effort to get it right. And then further along the dial is somebody who deliberately uses a wrong pronoun or a name. And those people are in very much different categories. So
I've got to say though, in work and stuff, I think most people generally are fairly, they just want to get on with the job, because me being trans has got nothing to do with the job I'm doing. So if they start to make it something to do. Now, if somebody wants to have a good faith conversation about me being trans, that's fine. I'm up for that. But the problem is that a lot of the people online, the people that, I would say Sex Matters and LGBT Alliance, they think we have the people trying to shut down free speech, because we actually enjoy those conversations if they're in good faith, I think. But the problem for me is when somebody comes to me point blank and goes, something
you're a bloke. You're a bloke.
Yeah, exactly. Which only happens
we've
to
all
me.
had. So
and it only happens online. Now, the only time in real life I've ever had a problem is when it's kind of, I've been in situations, one-on-one situations with a colleague, and they've got a bit too curious, and I'm thinking, well, do you really need to know about my sex?
Well, I mean, I think people have got to understand that you wouldn't ask a trans colleague a question that you wouldn't ask a cis colleague, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
And I always think it's important to keep those boundaries. I mean, in work terms, I don't tend to talk about myself when I'm running a case. Occasionally I shade into the fact that I have particular knowledge if I'm dealing with a trans case or a gender critical case, and you can make a joke of it sometimes as well. But when I'm there as the lawyer, even if it's a GC case or a trans case, it's not about me, it's about the other people, the people at the center of the case.
It
should never be about the lawyers. But but you are who you are.
I was going to say it's like people have tried to report me to my employer several times. Whenever I've been on TV, I get it, and because they know where I work, because I've done things for my employer in terms of diversity and inclusion, trans day visibility, so they know who I am. So the problem I have is I've got to say to my employer, look, people are going to complain about me. They'll say, but the problem is I'm very vocal on Twitter. So I had to delete a lot of things off Twitter because I'm pushed into a corner sometimes by people arguing with me, and I'll say, I'll say some pejorative to them, they'll say some pejorative to me, and then I'm in trouble because I'm the person that has the public face. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I'm in a similar position. I appear on social media. I never use an alias. I never hide behind someone else's picture or a picture that isn't a person. So I'm always very clear about who I am, and therefore it's a bit like back to having the "Don't be a nutter" post-it note on the side.
I need that post. I need that post-it note.
We'll write you one. I have strong views about certain things, and I will express those strong views. But I am a professional, and I need to be seen to be a professional. And the bar has guidance and at some extent rules about how you should appear on social media, and certainly you shouldn't appear in a way that reduces the public view of profession. Because we have placed enormous trust, barristers sometimes, in terms of the things we do, and you need that confidence from the public that you're going to behave appropriately. And if you're on social media pinging off left and right, being vile about other people on social media, then potentially you can be near or across that professional line.
So that's something I've had to learn quite quickly.
Yeah, well, you and I have talked about that previously, Frida, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
So this kind of comes on to that topic of libel, defamation, slander, and what the official legal definitions are. And as we do a podcast, and sometimes we don't have a guest, we just talk about issues that are going on in the news, and we do worry about crossing those lines. Would you have mentioned people's names, haven't we? Yeah, we do mention people's names, but we always try and keep it on the right side of those lines. I mean, how would you advise us on that, Robin?
The best defense, of course, is if it's true, it can't be libel or slander. So, but I always think I would never say anything on social media or on a podcast that I wouldn't say in public to someone's face.
I was going to say that, like, we've had this thing where we call somebody transphobic. We think they're obviously transphobic, not mention anybody's names, obviously, but I've said, oh, this person's a transphobe. And so there lies grey areas, because they could say, well, what I said meant this, and we've interpreted it as that.
Well, I always think it's better perhaps to focus on what's been said. So there are certain expressions and certain ways of characterizing trans people that you and I would think was offensive. Yeah. And people do that. And I think it's always better to talk about what's been said than the person concerned, because...
So focus on the topics rather than the individuals.
I think so. I mean, the lawyery version of that sometimes is that lawyers are sort of, in fact, I remember saying, I've said it in court today, is to cut out the adjectives. If the person has said something about a trans person that is insulting or inappropriate or, just not nice, well, that's the thing to comment on, as opposed to, I think, the person, because people can say things with all sorts of different motives. They may have a personal motive. They may have had some sort of difficult personal interaction. But I think it's very legitimate to comment on, this expression or that expression is offensive to trans people, because that's information that other people would find useful. I mean, young people can pick up comments from adults or older people, and if they hear someone saying something, once again, take an example that's not trans. If you get a young person who has a racist parent or racist relative, they might use an expression about people from ethnic minorities that is offensive and unpleasant, and known to be offensive and unpleasant in society. But if they've heard it in the home, then they might not know that. And much better to be saying, well, you shouldn't say that because this group of people will find that offensive, rather than say your dad is a racist or your mum is a racist. Yeah. And that allows, and there are ways of referring to trans. We focus on trans, but we're still pretty rare in society. Not big slices of society won't have met or spoken to a trans person. And some of the expressions about trans people that they have read in the newspapers or heard people use or whatever, they won't know that trans people find those things offensive, and might think that they're expressions that are okay to use. But that's about the expression, not the person.
Yeah, so keep it factual, keep it on topic, and maybe not so much talking about so and so said this, so and so said that kind of thing.
That's my approach.
Yeah. Can we just talk about the Scottish GRA reform? It's kind of stalled, fallen down.
Been
No,
blocked.
well, next ding ding seconds out, next round.
Yeah, what is the next round? Where are we going with that?
19th and 20th of September.
Mm.
Scottish Outer House, so their version of the High Court, in front of Lady Justice Haldane, and the Scottish government have brought judicial review proceedings claiming that the UK government's use of Section 35 of the Scotland Act is unlawful. And Lady Haldane will hear arguments over 2 days and then rule on that. Now, chances are, even if the Scottish government win at that stage, there's 2 stages of appeal. There's the Scottish Inner House, which is like their version of the Court of Appeal, and then potentially it comes to the Supreme Court in London.
Wow.
So certainly, unless there's a change of government along the way in the UK, it seems likely that it'll have to be fought through all 3 stages, because I can't see the UK government. Can you see this government rolling on its back and waving its legs in the air and saying that's fine? So I think there are going to be those stages to go through, but at least the Scottish government are up for the fight.
So we'll probably end up in the Supreme Court, and
we'll get a ruling probably in early October, I'd have thought, from that first stage in Scotland. But then there's another stage in Scotland, and then the Supreme Court potentially. So there are potentially 2 further stages in court after that.
And what's your view of how that whole thing was conducted, and the way the government tried to stop it using that Section 35?
Here we bump into law a bit. I'm slightly involved in some of that challenge,
right?
And so I have to be a bit careful about what I say. But so let's keep my comments lawyery, if we can put it that way.
Yeah.
So to be lawful, that use of Section 35 has to show that there's an adverse effect on the operation of equality law in the whole of the UK. And that's what the UK government have relied on. Now, some parts of that, and they published their reasons for doing that, and some parts of that have more substance than others. I mean, one part says that there'll be administrative difficulties for the tax authorities. Well, so there are already, because trans people can't change the base information on tax information unless they have a GRC.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of trans people who live with a name that doesn't match, for example, the sex on their tax records, and yet the tax authorities manage to cope with that perfectly well, because people have a unique taxpayer number, and actually the tax authorities don't care what your name is. As long as you're the unique taxpayer number, they'll collect the tax from you. So
we'll definitely collect
one might think that aspect of what the UK government had said is not so strong. There may be arguments about other parts of it that are stronger.
I did read the list of reasons. Some of them seem very tenuous at best.
Yeah, but others may require a bit more thinking about.
Yeah. So
I mean, this political climate has been ramped up recently, because I mean, apparently this is like the longest fought over piece of legislation in the Scottish Parliament. I've had to process.
There've been a couple of previous examples where the sort of UK government have rattled the sabre. There was one about immigrants and asylum, and the Scottish government stepped back because it was right that they were trespassing into an area that was really the preserve of the UK government overall. What is true is that it was the only time the Scots Parliament so far have sat beyond midnight, because there was a rearguard action being fought by the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament when it went through Parliament to debate every point, take every potential amendment.
There's been a lot of...
I was watching most of that as it was being.
Well, funnily enough, when we got to midnight, it turns out that the very eco-friendly Scottish Parliament building turns its own lights off at midnight if nobody else does. And so we were all sat there, and the security people came around and said, well, we're all, and the MPs were still in the chamber, and they came around and said, well, everybody needs to sit still at midnight because we need to press a button to turn the lights back on again. There was no way to stop them going off because the Scots Parliament had never sat beyond midnight before.
So you were plunged into darkness.
We had 10 or 15, it's like 15 seconds of, do we play musical chairs or do what we do? Everybody sat still, and whoever it was pressed the right button and the lights came on again.
From an outside perspective, just watching it, it just seemed like there was so much effort from various lobby groups to influence the public opinion, talking about prisons, talking about sports, talking about things that probably have nothing to do. And it was to create a climate of discourse about trans people that I'd never seen so much of, because I was being rang up by, Talk TV, can you come on and talk about Isla Bryce? And I thought, do you know what? I don't actually want to talk about this because I don't know anything about it. And if you want a trans person to talk about this, you'd have to get somebody that's worked in a prison. I'm sorry. But it's like, it was constantly like this. And I'm thinking, why? Because I did do a little experiment with Talk TV and GB News, and I counted how many times the word trans was mentioned one day. And it was something like 60 or 70. And that wasn't even when they had a trans topic. They were just speaking generally about the news. And it seems to be constant now that we've become
I have to say, trans is being used as a wedge issue.
Yes, it is.
In politics.
Absolutely.
And there's no doubt about that.
And there's a similar thing in America as well, I think.
Well, yeah, it's not working so well. And America have tried this. And it was a bit disastrous in the midterm elections a while ago. Arguably, the Conservative government haven't got very good arguments on economic matters in the UK. They're not doing so well on economic matters. And so there's this idea that you can have a culture war, and that is a way of showing commitment to their people, if I can put it that way. In my view, it's a terrible mistake. As it happens, whisper it quietly, but I'm an old-fashioned liberal Tory. I believe in free enterprise. My dad ran his own business, but I also believe in safety nets and looking after people in society. There's no place for me in the current Tory party because they took this, they drank in a massive dose of UKIP and moved to the right.
Yeah.
And I'm equally, I'll be frank, I'm a European. I believe in Britain being having an active part in Europe. So that to me was an amazingly crazy thing to do.
It was indeed.
But that's those are my beliefs, and I think I'm really, really sad because the Conservative Party, the old Conservative Party, had some really good features about it. Every party has good and bad, but what we now have is just awful. Deserves to be out of power.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let's hope we can have some sort of reset in UK politics. The odd thing is that I've been doing some parliamentary law recently, and you've seen me operating in Parliament, and I have really good links to all four political parties, significant parties in the UK, so Conservative, Liberal, Labour, and the SNP, and appear to be trusted by useful people from each party, and it's a good way to be able to influence the future in a particular small area.
Well, the only people that have written back to me when I've expressed concerns have been Caroline Noakes, Anam Kazar, and Penny Mordaunt. And
there you go.
And it's you see, because I was arguing with people recently about because I've got this thing.
Am I getting a bit dark? Do I need to put my light on in my hotel room?
No, it's fine.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
No, it's fine. It's just I was going to say Labour don't seem too different to the Tory party at the moment. I don't see a lot of difference in their policy making or policy ideas.
No, well, Sir Keir Starmer seems to be working hard to. I think he has a really difficult task because he's got an enormous lead at the moment. Historically, the Labour Party is very good at starting a fight in a room with only the Labour Party in the room. And Sir Keir Starmer must be sitting there worried that something will happen over the next year or so until we get to a general election to threaten that enormous lead. Because unfortunately, there are some people. I mean, we've just had some fighting about the mayor in the northeast of England in the last few days. The northeast mayor, I've forgotten his name, but wasn't selected for re-election, and Labour have selected a new candidate, and the existing northeast mayor has said he's then going to stand as an independent. And Labour does have a bit of a history of starting a fight with itself, especially if it thinks it's in a comfortable place. And I can sort of understand Sir Keir Starmer wanting to sit quietly on the fence and keep everybody together, ready for what general election that comes along. And let's hope that they follow their libertarian and individual rights-based history and do right by people in the future. If
there is a danger in sitting on the fence.
Apart from a very pointy thing sticking in your bottom.
Well, it's just very
that lead
disappointing,
they have couldn't, there's quite a few months between now and the election for it to,
well, it's just
erode
really
away.
To me, it's just really sad that politicians are being asked questions like, "Can a woman have a
I know,
penis?" It's like, I know why they do it, because it's a cheap shot, and Nick Ferrari can play those kind of games, but it's like when I
Prime Minister can make jokes about trans
horrible,
and the rest of it, and that is playing to a particular slice of the political demographic, and it's an awful thing to do. I mean, it condemns the people who'll do those things.
Yeah.
I mean, once again, we haven't seen that from Sir Keir Starmer. He hasn't made,
he's not come out with a clear statement, has he? He's never.
No. But he hasn't done the sort of thing that Rishi Sunak's done, and I don't know, Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman have done in terms of those statements and some elements. But equally, there are some Labour members who are very gender critical.
There are, indeed,
and not perhaps having so much influence in the party. I mean, a lot of people are critical of the Labour Party for not sitting on Rosie Duffield, for example.
Well, I was going to mention.
Yeah.
I mean, I've complained about her many times, and she just seems to double down every time, and with no punishment, nothing seems to happen.
It's as though they're scared to do it because they worry about losing votes.
I have absolutely no brief for the senior members of the Labour Party, but I suspect that they're in a position of not wanting to start that fight within the party. The fight be somewhere else, and hopefully, as I say, once they're in power, their libertarian traditions. They are the party who enacted the Equality Act. Will take over.
Let's hope.
They are a party based on individuals and people in a not big business in a way that some of the other, certainly the Conservative Party are. So, I don't mean it as a political comment, but I think there is a political reality out there. And in my view, if we're considering how trans rights are likely to progress, then if we're going to choose between Conservative and Labour, it's a pretty straightforward choice, I would have thought.
Yeah, let's talk about the HRC, because there's been a couple of things that have been going on recently. The first one would be the guidance document they put out, really, the non-statutory guidance document. And then the train wreck, as you call it, yeah. And then the other thing was this, the redefinition of, the definition of sex.
The letter to Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah. So what would you say about those two issues?
I think the HRC has plainly lost its way under Kishore Faulkner. Take the guidance published in April 2022. Firstly, it's not consistent with the statutory guidance. It's actually contrary to the statutory guidance, therefore contrary to law. And it appears to be a set of instructions for how you can lawfully discriminate.
Yeah.
You know, that seems to be its logical focus.
And some of the examples they use
Did
in
you-
that thing are just
Yeah.
horrendous.
No,
Did you see the latest meeting?
But the really good bit, I think Frida's just drawn attention to that, is that at a fairly recent board meeting of the AHRC, they go, well, some people are following our non-statutory guidance, but a lot of people don't like it and think it's you know, nasty to trans people and therefore aren't following it. Well, they probably read my takedown of it, hopefully.
Yeah.
And business, see, one of the things, during the Boris period, there were some proposals to be nasty to trans people in the way that law might change. And actually what happened is that business ganged up on the Conservative Party and said, we value our trans employees and we value our trans customers, and we don't want laws that are nasty to trans people. And the Boris administration backed off doing something that it might have done. And actually,
yeah, I mean, that was around the time when they were having that international conference that got cancelled, and you know, Trans in the City were involved. With all that stuff at the time. Yeah,
business. You see, it's back to that. We talked earlier about organisations who value diversity, and business certainly does. Business knows that if it wants, you know, a wide variety of people through the door to buy their stuff, work for them, do whatever, then inclusive is the way forward, and being vile to people is not the way forward. And so, you know, a lot of people were quite scared when we left the EU, for example, because, you know, there are European directives that had got baked into our laws and now are not in quite the same way. The UK Parliament has got quite a degree of freedom in how it changes things. But for example, the Bill of Rights that, oh dear, who was that MP from Surrey who's no longer there anymore?
I'm not sure.
Anyway, I've forgotten his name, who was promoting the Bill of Rights, such a small person. And that's been dropped. So the Bill of Wrongs has been dropped by the current government. They're not going to try and push that through before the end of their time. So I think actually society is
that Dominic Raab?
That's who I meant. I was being worried about. Yeah. That was his big thing. And of course that's not going forward. So you know, the present government is happily being horrible about immigrants in terms of the asylum bills just going through Parliament just at this moment. But the Bill of Wrongs didn't go forward. And the schools guidance that is batting to and fro between Gillian Keane and Kemi Badenoch. I don't know if you saw Kemi was being interviewed from New Zealand.
I did see that.
Yes,
she was talking about that trade agreement,
there's something coming out this week, isn't there? On this?
Well, but then she was interviewed about schools guidance, and what you had the Telegraph at the weekend saying it's coming out this week, and now it's not, because we hear from the Cabinet Office that it's actually the final version is not with number 10.
Okay.
And what you tend to get, because journalism has some very low standards these days in the UK, and you get what are called bounce articles. So where a particular view is taken and the people who run and own the Telegraph would like that pushed forward, they will publish something like, it's coming out this week. So that if somebody has to turn around and say, no, it's not, then outrage can be outrage about it's not coming out this week. And they're really struggling to be able to publish schools guidance that's sufficiently nasty to satisfy the people who like nasty schools guidance, but is right side of the law. And it's actually really difficult to discriminate lawfully.
It seems to fit the news agenda rather than the public will, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean,
it seems to be like this constant Kemi Badenoch's playing to the press rather than to the electorate.
I have a significant schools practice, and I advise schools on discrimination matters and safeguarding matters. And schools want to do the best by the children who are there. They want helpful guidance that says, when because not every school deals with a trans person, when the trans person comes to the headmistress's office and says, Miss, I'd like to talk to you about, I've got an issue I'd like to talk to you about, or the parents turn up with their child and say, as of the new term, we'd like John to be Jane or Jane to be John or whatever in the new term, then what do you do? And that's what schools need. They want guidance that is helpful and practical and all the rest of it. They don't want to be the centre of a political row about how you deal with people.
Yeah.
And the bounce articles are really unhelpful. But I mean,
But it seems there was a story a few weeks ago about it was a case of school bullying. Really, there was a child that was expressing gender, and then the two girls seemed to be. I don't know if it was bullying, but they were having this heated discussion, and the teacher stepped in, and then
the cat.
Yeah, and the story was it became that there were children tying there were cats. But the problem with that is that's an old trope. We've seen that story before.
What it seemed to be is that one of the children in the conversation with the teacher has said, well, how would it be if somebody identified as a cat?
Yeah.
As part of the conversation. And that was picked up on by Kemi Badenoch, who raced, it was almost like dial 999 and every school inspector in the southeast had to rush off to Rye to inspect.
And it's just come out, hasn't it?
And it's complete nonsense.
Yeah.
There is no child identifying as a cat at Rye and the school.
Well, we knew that.
So these train wreck bits of guidance that keep coming out, and we seem to have had train wreck 1. We've had number 2, number 3's on its way. Just getting back to that definition of sex thing. Where do you think that's going to end up?
I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
No,
to be honest. I think it's so difficult to do, and the consequences are so bonkers. So what we're gonna end up with trans men forced into women's lavatories. We've seen the effect of bathroom bills in the US.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, the people who are really affected by bathroom bills tended to be gender variant lesbians, because there are, by my calculations, there are around 40 times the number of butch lesbians in the population as trans people. So if we're thinking about who's going to get challenged for their use of public toilet facilities, surprise, surprise, in the US, it wasn't trans people, it was butch lesbians largely.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is just totally it's unworkable. I mean, how do you enforce something like that? It's madness.
Who's going to stand there? I mean, okay, we know that Kelly J, Minchell, Keane, whatever she calls herself, wants people to stand there guarding entrances with, automatic weapons, but we don't live in that country, fortunately.
Yeah.
So it's and when I go to the loo in Sainsbury's at the weekend and do my business in the place I do that and don't cause anybody any difficulty, we're still British. And the thing about being British is that you don't make a fuss, and exactly. If people, the way our society works is if you're not really affecting other people, then, it's a bit like when we still smoked. I mean, nobody that I know smokes anymore, but when we were working through that, we got to a point where you could smoke, but as long as you don't impose it on somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much true of, that's the way Britain works, is that if people are minding their own business and getting on with their own business, people don't want to be bothered by, ideological people who are going to leap out of the nearest bush and say, aha, you're not female enough to go into that, in through that door. It's the moment you start to get to that point, the majority of the British population go, why?
Yeah, it just seems to me that people like, Kelly J. Keane are the aggressors, because and what they want seems to be being talked about is in terms of, in government.
At the moment, we've got
it emboldens people.
A horrible right-wing government who aren't running the economy particularly well, got us into Brexit, which is a bit of a disaster.
Yeah, they've had to get that.
I've got plenty of people who are actually struggling to pay their bills, having to use, food banks and things, are facing high inflation, which starts to raise difficulties with things like pay settlements and civil service and
mortgages.
What have we got? We've got the doctors in dispute at the moment, and we junior doctors. who don't really have good answers to those things, and so will happily fancy a culture war. We have media who are happy to fan those flames because either it supports the people they'd like to support, or it sells newspapers or advertising around electronic versions of newspapers, clickbait. And we just have to, as trans people, we just have to sort of grit our teeth, know that the wheel will turn, and wait until it gets better. And it will. And that's
one of the things I worry about is if I was to ever need a barrister such as yourself, how on earth would I afford it? Now, this is a worry when you run into issues like I did with, my kind of Centre Parks case, where I was asking questions around, does the SPA have any rules around trans people using changing rooms? And it got into a big spat, which was eventually sorted out by a carefully worded letter from a barrister, which it didn't cost me any money in the end. So how do people afford it?
Yeah, in financial terms, you're either very brave, like Rose Taylor was, put themselves on the line financially, which is what she did. Or if you're a working person, join a trade union, right? Because trade unions will support working people through arguing about their individual rights, and you can then afford. My chambers are quite big on union instructions, and we've done some quite significant cases for workers and via unions. There is crowdfunding, which sometimes works if you've got a case that will catch the public imagination. And there are legal advice services who offer free legal advice or on occasion representation and help. And indeed, some people have insurance attached to their, between a quarter and a third of people have legal expenses insurance attached to their mortgages if you've got a mortgage, because the mortgage company would rather that somebody who's out of work sues and gets a settlement and continues to pay the mortgage rather than the mortgage company have to foreclose. But yeah, it's an issue. I mean, I'm reassuringly expensive.
Which is a good thing to hear. Really.
That's the conflict. You're either cheap or people might think you're rubbish or expensive. And
always get the lawyer that you can afford, right? The most expensive you can afford.
Well, no win, no fee is difficult, because I try and persuade people not to go down that route, because if we succeed, we take a big fat bite out of their compensation. But some people can't afford to bring the case.
It seems
so. I guess the first step in a case is what, to have a free chat with somebody and just have that initial discussion.
I do what's called direct access. So you can come to me without a solicitor. In certain circumstances, I wouldn't take every case, but you can usually find a lawyer to give you a first view on something. But I would say, if you're a working person, join a union. And if not, then you've got to find some other way. If you're an employer, join the trade organisation related to your organisation, or there are lawyers or other organisations that offer trade deals for employers in terms of dealing with things. So there's usually a way, and there are other funding models as well.
And I guess if it's an important case like Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover, that will get the attention of, barristers who are interested in those, forwarding those cases.
Can do.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that kind of gets us to the point where, I think we need to ask you, what do we need to do as trans people? There's various kind of activism that we can do. I'm not sure about how effective it all is, but what's your view on activism and what we can do as trans people to try and change some of this negative stuff that's going on?
I mean, what I would say is that everyone can do different things. People shouldn't do anything they're uncomfortable doing. I mean, I'm very comfortable standing up the front and being the tip of the missile, and that's not where everybody wants to be. But there are always quiet things that you can do. I mean, I live in a delightful little Somerset village, with only a few hundred people. And we have a women's group in the village. Some years ago, they started it a couple of years before I moved to the village, and they found that to affiliate to the WI was several £100s a year. And they very sensibly said, what do we get for our several £100s a year? And the answer was a list of suggested speakers and the ability to call yourself the Women's Institute. And they thought, well, we could keep our several £100s a year and spend it on gin and call ourselves, call ourselves, and my village starts with an S, so I won't say what it is, but it's the something starting with an S, Ladies and Girls Group. Just think of the initials for a moment. Have you thought it through?
Oh yeah.
All right. So that's what it's called in the village. And after I'd lived there for a bit, they said, would you come and do a talk? And I said, law? No. Railways? No. Trans things. Oh, okay. All right. So I did the talk for this 30 or 40 people in a Somerset village, 30, 40 ladies in a Somerset village about transition and my background and my history and my struggles and how it worked out for me and what have you. And the way you find out whether that's gone well in our village is that you go and ask Roger, who runs the village shop. Or in fact, this year it's just become a community shop in our village, but he used to run the village shop and it was the centre of all gossip in the village. And so a couple of days later, I popped into the village shop and I said, Roger, how did that go? And he said, oh, they really liked it. But there were one or two questions that they thought one or two people wanted to ask, but they didn't know they could ask in a sort of collective group about things. Would you mind answering a few more questions? And I said, no, of course not. So for about a year, whenever I walked into the village to get my newspaper, Granny would pop out of the side door of the cottage and say, I really liked your talk, but can I offer you a cup of tea when you come back from the shop? Because there were a couple of things I wanted to ask. And so I've had those private conversations as well. So there is this Somerset village that's sort of ready for its next trans person. They've understood it and they've got it. And I think earlier I talked about changing the world one person at a time.
Yeah.
And what I would say to trans people is, don't be frightened of who you are. Find those few people that you're comfortable to talk to about your circumstance, reach out into the community and find those and do your changing of the world, one or two people at a time. Yeah. And so the next time that trans issues come up, trans people, for that one or two people, are no longer the ogre that gender critical people think we are, or the media say we are, or whatever. But what happens is that those people think, well, hang on a moment, I've got my trans friend who's actually pretty normal and has the same desires and goals in life that I do or my friends do, and they're not like that. They're just another member, just another person. And you will have won the future, that one or two people at a time. And if you do nothing else, do that.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is, do each to their own, do what you can, do what you're comfortable with, one by one, as we go.
Live your life.
Some people will go on TV, some will do other things.
Live your life well, but do it as openly as you feel able to.
Yeah.
And if you're able to reach out into the community a bit, then do that. Join your community, be part of your community as yourself, and don't be frightened of doing that. And that will gradually win the future.
Yeah. And what would your message be to the trans community, of which we are all members?
At the moment,
with all this negativity going on.
Yeah, just have courage. It will pass. It might take a little while. It's quite an uncomfortable time at the moment, but very likely we're going to have a change of government within, spitting political distance, where things will be better. And even if you're a Conservative, I suspect the effect will be that the Conservative Party will have to rebuild itself after losing the next general election, and may hopefully come to the view that actually those policies it was pursuing and the way it was doing things weren't the right way. So even if you're a Conservative trans person, there may be a positive future for you. But for trans people generally, sometimes the wheel doesn't always turn forward as fast as we'd like it. But for the moment, the job is to sort of hold the ratchet in place and stop it turning backwards.
Yeah.
But the world always moves on. There always is the next issue and the next issue. At the moment, trans people are having a tough time, but that won't be so in a small number of years' time. And we just need to not be excluded from society, take our place, show that we are responsible, respectable members of society with a contribution to make.
Yeah.
Frida, I mean, I know you have a job that's tremendously important in terms of our society. I have a job that I love doing, and people pay me to do. But you're a healthcare worker, and you're far more important than I am.
I don't know. Well, the thing I like about my job is I meet so many different people all the time, and I have a new social situation nearly every day when I'm at work. And I've been privileged to be part of training diversity courses because people recognize that I'm part of.
Everybody should do it to the extent they're comfortable, should do a small bit of that. And life will get better. It has done for every minority community, bit by bit by bit. And, if you'd been a gay person in the UK 30 years ago with Section 28 and the way the media was, you couldn't have believed that we would have got to the position we are now, where none of that's acceptable anymore. And in 30 years' time, I mean, the shame is I won't be around to see it, of course, but in 30 years' time, I'm sure trans people will be in that position. How quickly we get there depends on us all just gently moving forward.
So hope for the future. I think your words have calmed a lot of people there.
Yeah.
You've got to be an optimist. If you live my life, you have to be an optimist. I mean, here I am, accepted in one of the great professions, having a really fun time, doing well in my profession, being respected in what I do, loving what I do, being able to help a few people and a few organisations in terms of what they do. What could be better?
Well,
exactly.
It's been great speaking to you. Before you end up in complete darkness, because I can see the sun setting around you. I was going to say,
it's glamorous Croydon, and
right.
we get the law I do takes me all over the country and Scotland, Northern Ireland as well.
Well, I'll be looking out for you.
Really glamorous places. So
I'll be looking out for you on parliamentary select committee meetings and TV again. So at the end of, shall we do the song, Vicky?
We do. There is a bit of a tradition.
You don't have to do it.
Where we have a little song at the end of the podcast. It's a very simple song, and it's just one line. It's "Don't forget to subscribe." And Frida is our, resident expert.
I do a bit of music.
So she's going to lead us.
So
okay,
it's very simple. There's nothing to worry about.
We've never got it completely right. So I think Susie Green was the best at this.
Susie Green was good. Yes.
We'll try. The song goes, "Don't forget to subscribe." That's it.
That's it.
And Vicky will count us in.
I got to sing this with you then.
Yes, you're if you would, please.
Well, you don't have to.
So Frida, you lead us, because that's your role.
If you count us in.
Okay,
1, 2, 3.
2, 3.
Don't forget to subscribe. Well, that was terrible.
It was as good as the rest.
I don't tap dance either.
No, we're not asking you to tap dance.
That was going to be my next question. Well, again, thank you for giving us your time. I know it's precious, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Robin, for coming on and doing this. It's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, speak to you soon.
And to all those people who might be watching or listening, thank you for spending some time with us. Please don't forget to subscribe. Come back, listen to us again, and we'll see you soon. So
bye for now.
I think we'll sign us off there. That's it for today. Bye for now.